It gives me great pleasure to invite the first speaker for the proposition team to open the debate. Please welcome Tan Hui Min.
Increasingly, we have seen states use the tool of defamation laws and criminal courts to silence dissent and impose a chilling effect on discourse. We live in a free society, and we have a duty to reject this reality. Our principle is the rule of law, not rule by law. And that's why defamation should never be a criminal offense. We have three arguments. One, that doesn't meet the criteria for a crime. Two, that criminal defamation shuts down discourse. And three, my second speaker will tell you why it hurts victims. Before that, what is defamation? It refers to any speech act that may affect the reputation of an individual or entity. Currently, laws on defamation differ from state to state. In most cases, it's covered under civil law, but in some states, it is a criminal act. By prosecute, we refer to the state prosecuting individuals for committing a crime. This is different from a civil suit, where individuals bring a case against an accused so as to seek financial redress. Thus, while the state can impose punishments such as a fine or a jail term on individuals, the civil courts can only demand compensation and settlement fees. Our policy is simple. One, we believe that defamation is a civil case and not a criminal offense. And this means that states will not prosecute any and all cases of defamation. Instead, groups and individuals may bring their case of defamation to civil courts where they demand redress for any damages, economic damages caused. To be clear, there is still legal channel to redress this harm. Three, this policy will apply to similar speech acts like libel or slander, and obviously the state itself cannot sue individuals for defamation in this case. First argument, that in principle, defamation doesn't meet the criteria for a crime. We need to ask, what does state prosecution and therefore punishment mean? It means that the state is using its monopoly of force to take away your rights. It could be your right to property, but in many cases, it is your right to freedom of movement when you are put in jail. See, because the burdens are so high when you are punished by the state, there are similarly incredibly high burdens that the act must meet in order before it can be considered a crime. In principle, defamation doesn't meet this for three reasons. One, because states should prosecute you therefore only when your act breaks a rule which is necessary for society's functioning. So for example, if I steal something from you, then that breaks the right to property. And if property rights aren't upheld in society, it's impossible for the state to function. In the same way, if I murder you and your life isn't protected, it's impossible for the state to function because people have no protections. We don't think defamation meets this criteria. Why? Because the Speech Act doesn't break any rule which is necessary for society to function. In fact, we'll argue later on that it enhances the act of discourse which is so necessary for society to move forward. Similarly, that's the reason why, even though adultery may cause emotional and often very strong harms, we don't prosecute it as a crime, because that isn't what happens, because it doesn't make society break down if their rights are protected. So civil suits are better because they are fitted to the individual harms caused instead of defamation, not society and its rules. Second reason, because the burdens are so high, the state, in a criminal case, must prove beyond reasonable doubt that you are guilty to justify taking away your rights. Say, in defamation, you systemically cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt. Why? One, because the harm is mediated through many other causes. If I call my third speaker a racist, that doesn't mean it's automatically harm. It requires all of you in this room to also believe that he's a racist. We think that links to the second reason, that often it is multi-causal. It's not clear that my particular speech act causes the direct harm to you and that harm to your reputation wouldn't have come out through other means. For example, if people themselves already believe this to be true. No. So we think that harm systemically cannot be proved. Because it's impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the chain of causality from my speech act to the grievous harm that is done to you if they claim there's grievous harm. Because we think this harm is too vague to prove, we don't think that's something you can prosecute. Civil cases are better. One, because it's often a negotiative process. So it isn't the case of assigning blame beyond all reasonable doubt. That's why most civil cases are resolved in settlements outside the court proceedings. Second, we say even if settlements can't be achieved, in a civil case, the burden of proof on the plaintiff is not beyond reasonable doubt. It's about balance of probabilities, which is something you can do in a civil case. Systemically can't do beyond reasonable doubt for a criminal case. Hold on a moment. So we don't think you should be prosecuting it defamation as a criminal case. Yes?
Should people be prosecuted for lying in court?
We say that one has a much clearer harm because you're lying in court as perjury. So if I lie and say you did something when you actually didn't, you will definitely go to jail. That is a very clear harm. We don't think that's the same. In fact, we argue possibly, maybe not, if you think it's exactly the same cases. We don't think so. Third reason, because the state feels that there has to be a fixed sentence. Because the justice meted out by the state as a punishment for a crime needs to be even across all individuals who commit that crime. The problem is that the harms from defamation are variable, even for the exact same act. So if I say that a particular politician is corrupt, the harm to that politician depends on his position, whether he's a cabinet minister or just a backbencher MP. So the harms that accrue to him are very different. We see when the state imposes a blanket penalty for this as a crime, we don't think it takes into account the variable harms, unlike civil courts, where the recompense you get is based on the specific circumstances and that harm. So we think that systemically, defamation does not meet the criteria for a crime. Civil courts are much better at resolving the problem. You cannot prosecute defamation. Second argument on discourse. And our principle here is very clear. That discourse is important because it's key to the flourishing and discussion of ideas in our society for society to move forward. We say prosecuting for defamation is uniquely harmful in several ways. One, in all cases we say when a criminal court passes a judgment, it systemically shuts down the discussion. Hold on a moment. Because the verdict lays down what it perceives to be the truth. And this means there's no further discussion in public because it's illegal to say what you said before. Yes?
Why are valid criticisms of big public figures not devalued when they are seen as indistinguishable from obviously false ones?
Okay, if things are obviously false, people know they're obviously false. If things are true, they know they're like, no. Back to my point. We say that this means that in civil courts, the negotiative nature I talked about earlier on means that very often the offending party agrees to retract its earlier statements and admit that that's a falsehood. We think that in the public mind, that's much clearer in saying that this is something which wasn't actually true. I think this resolution is important because it's important to prove that this lie which was said wasn't just a lie as laid down by the state, but in public, to convince the public that this was actually a lie, and that's how discourse can happen. But second, we see very often defamation laws occur in states which aren't the most liberal, which are in fact the vast majority of states in the world, right? Because most states are not the US or the UK or France. So here, the accountability of government institutions needs to be, it's undermined when you have defamation as a criminal act. Because under a criminal act, if I say the civil service is inept and only serves the ruling party, then the state can shut me down. Under a civil suit, there is no entity, there's no civil servant who can sue me for that statement when I make it. So we see that discourse on the government services and government branches is much stronger in our side than is improvement on the government services. Finally, we argue that the chilling effect is much higher when you have it as a crime. Because the threat of state punishment is much higher. We say that, and therefore people are unwilling to say things for fear they will be defamatory, even if they are not sure that it is. Say under civil suits, it is much better. One, because the punishments are less severe, quite clearly. But two, because politicians are also less likely to keep suing you if they think that you'll make them look very litigious. Whereas they always blame the state if the state is not prosecuting you. That's why in Argentina, President Kirchner doesn't sue individuals who say that her presidency is lousy. She gets the deputy public prosecutor to do it, and then says, I had nothing to do with this, it was the Attorney General's office instead. So we think that in these ways, state prosecution of defamation chills discourse. It doesn't meet the criteria for a crime. I'm so proud to stand in proposition.
Thank the first opposition speaker for his speech. And now to open the debate for the opposition. I call open Ellie.
do that, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about the vast majority of defamation cases around the world. Not talk about a low-impact motion that affects only a handful of them. But we still say that furthermore, even on Singapore's best ground about defamation as a criminal offence, it is still harmful enough, we're going to show you why it's harmful enough, that we're absolutely fine with it being both a criminal and a civil offence. We come to you today under the team line that decriminalising defamation distorts debate and destroys decent. In terms of our stance briefly, we support defamation laws where public statements can be prosecuted in civil and sometimes, rarely, criminal cases. Defence of truth should certainly be present within these laws.
Information.
No, thank you, in most countries around the world. And we support a balanced burden of proof on both sides. There is a middle ground between, say, the USA, where the burden of proof on plaintiffs is very high, and South Korea, where it is very low. We support that middle ground. And it's obviously not our burden, ladies and gentlemen, to support the misapplication of these laws. I'm going to come on to that a little bit later.
Point of information.
No, thank you. In my speech, I'm going to be looking at why free speech should not be protected in this instance, why the harm and reputational damage are so great, and then Sam's speech is going to be bringing you how this distorts debate. Firstly,
Information.
In terms of rebuttal. Singapore told us defamation isn't a crime, and they gave us kind of a few grounds on which it's not a crime. We're going to dispute this characterization. Because firstly, they
Information,
say that, no thank you, defamation doesn't really break a rule that's so damaging to society. Well, throughout our speeches, we're going to tell you why defamation itself, when it's allowed, devalues the entirety of speech in that society, its value for discovering truth. That is certainly a harm to public discourse and debate. No, thank you. And secondly, the idea that you can't really see the direct impact. Well, we pointed out that the harms of lies can be measured in other cases, such as perjury. And it's not really fair for them to say, well, ruining someone's life is not a harm, but sending them to jail is one. We don't think that's a sufficient distinction for them.
Point of information.
No, thank you. And secondly, they said, well, civil cases are better than. And ultimately, we say that, look, even if we take them on their ground of criminalisation, we say that often the state is very necessary because civil cases are not sufficient to bring the kind of big media companies to justice that often are so needed to protect people's overall well-being. No, thank you. And finally, in the case of illiberal countries, we say that these countries are going to imprison dissenters anyway. Defamation is a symptom of their illiberality, not the cause. This point isn't really relevant and impactful in today's debate. Okay. Why should free speech not be protected in this instance? Well, the first part of this principle is that we have no obligation to protect lies in the public. And that's because lies,
Point of information.
No, thank you, Paul. Devalue the entirety of speech in general. It devalues speech's ability to be used in the public sphere to discover truth. And when defending this speech compromises speech as a whole, Team England are happy to say that
Point of
defamation
information.
should not be prosecuted. Yes.
So, will you prosecute a Christian who says that his son goes around the earth?
Not sure how that's relevant to today's debate, but like, I mean, that is not a true fact, so very confusing information, I'm sure I'll explain it later. Okay, but furthermore, the importance of free speech to self-expression is also damaged in a world where defamation is used. Because when lies can be released about you in the public sphere, your self-expression is damaged. Because you no longer control how people can see you. You no longer control how your image gets out in the public sphere. It's damaging self-information as well. No, thank you. But furthermore, we recognise that free speech can be traded off against real and tangible harms to people. That's why incitement to violence is banned in jurisdictions across the world. And ultimately, the harms of defamation may not be physical, but Team England say that they are still very real. And that brings me nicely on to my second point about damage to reputation. Because the reason this necessarily occurs, I'll take you in a second, in cases where defamation is involved, is because in the worst case scenarios, there are media outlets maliciously pursuing people and trying to ruin their lives. But even in the best cases, where they're just ignorant or jumping on an existing bandwagon, ignorance is no defence. The harms are still there, and the defamation still causes great damage, yes.
Okay, so you say lies in public discourse value all true statements in public discourse. that the sun goes around the earth is a lie that devalues these other statements, so therefore, would you prosecute him?
I mean, sure, if it was causing like reputational damage to people, then we probably would, but it's ultimately a tangential and rather like bad example to characterize what our principle is actually about. Okay, so these statements about allegations of criminality, about infidelity, about other immoral behaviour that you have not committed, get out of the public sphere, and they have terrible consequences. You can't walk down the street without getting sued. You might lose your job. Because remember, ladies and gentlemen, we're not just talking about the biggest
information
figures, no thank you, and celebrities. We could be talking about something as simple as a local newspaper printing a story about you, impacting local, but it's still damaging to your life. But furthermore, we say there is a damaging effect on other people. Because when Max Mosley, the Formula One tycoon, had disgusting allegations about his private life printed in the media,
Point of information.
His son committed suicide. And when the media accused the victim of an NYPD shooting of being a drug dealer, his family were left wondering whether the memory of someone they had already lost, a son, a brother, was really the wrongdoer. And ultimately, these harms are illegitimate and can be extended to criminalisation because you have not done anything to deserve that extreme damage. You are not suffering the consequences of something you did, you're suffering the consequences of a lie and a malicious rumour. And ultimately we say on our side of the house, the defamation, whether civil or criminal, is a good compensation for these harms. In the civil case, because financial compensation can often represent financial damage that was done to you because of your loss of reputation, but also can just generally be part of the principle of offering financial compensation for non-financial harms like accidents. But even in the cases of criminal cases, just the fact of seeing justice being done and feeling like the state is sympathetic to the harms that have been accrued to you is a very important thing. Ultimately, it's better than nothing at all, ladies and gentlemen. It's better than not receiving any justice. And ultimately, on their side of the house, when defamation is allowed to grow much more freely than it would be on our side, you get more defamation. You get less fact-checking by papers that know they won't face legal repercussions on anything like the same scale if they print a story that isn't true. Decriminalising defamation distorts debate and destroys public discourse. Decent people, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the first opposition speaker for her speech. And now to continue the case for the proposition, I call open Esugo Lee.
I hate to say this, but when opposition comes up and tells us we focus on the narrow technical details of a state, a criminal instance versus a civil lawsuit, you know what that really means? They were afraid to clash with what the spirit of this debate called for. Because it's not a debate about opposing defamation in general. It's about the state prosecuting you when defamation occurs. We want the few following speakers to engage on the specific nuance of the motion. So we think they haven't put their burden on showing why state prosecution in particular is a good thing. So let's ask two questions. First, on their principles, second, about discourse. First, the main principle from opposition is that lies devalue speech. But already we saw a concession to their principle when we asked you, if I say that the moon goes around the sun, for instance, is that then something you will prosecute? Because that's a lie, and by their own metric, it hurts the truth. So they were principally inconsistent. Then they shifted to say, but it's different because it doesn't hurt your reputation. So no, what they stand for isn't just about devaluing truth, but it's about value speech more? Is it when we have open and frank discourse, where there might be lies in the public, but people can respond and say, that is a lie which I don't believe in because I am more aware of it? Or speech protected when the government says, no, you aren't allowed to say that. We will artificially shut you down and shut you out of the public sphere. We think our side protects and values speech more. No. But finally, what about the grey areas? Because if I want to legitimately criticize a government as being corrupt, that is something which might be true. But nonetheless, is something the government and the state can easily prosecute me for under defamation. So for these grey areas, where there might be huge truth value, opposition steals and kills the truth. But finally, we saw them shift to a broader, unnuanced principle that harm in general justifies state prosecution. Okay, in our first speaker, we told you that if you break a contract, that's a civil lawsuit. Sure, there might be harm because I've broken the contract, but nonetheless, it's out of the sphere of the state. They haven't responded to this analysis. We further give you parallels to adultery, which similarly might be a harm, but nonetheless is a civil instance. No, so yes, the state can still be sympathetic on our side because we have civil lawsuits. That is something they haven't engaged with. Finally, let's point out everything they haven't dealt with in our first speaker. We told you that you can't trace the direct impact because it's multi-causal. And this is where it's different from perjury, lying in court. Because you can see that when I lie in court, in the isolated instance, that's when I hamper the court process. When I go on the public sphere and I lie, that depends on whether people believe me. That depends on my prior reputation. That depends on the friends I have. All of which means I can't trace a direct impact. No. On the last point, illiberal regimes will do it anyway. This is a honestly flippant answer. You make it easier for illiberal regimes to clamp down on dissidents because now they look legitimate. They can say, I have a law in place. But what about even for not so illiberal regimes? Regimes on the middle ground that are semi-democratic. You make it easier for states to shut down dissidents as well. No. So on to the second argument then about discourse, the chilling effect. They never took down what we gave in our first speaker about how you enable and how you disable criticism of entire state officers. Not just individual officials, but of the state officers. For instance, the judiciary. No, hold on a minute, madam. But here I'm going to add further analysis as to why they shut down discourse. So even on their own metric of protecting speech, they failed. But before that, yes.
How likely is Fox News to be punished by a civil suit?
Well, a civil suit is perfectly acceptable because Fox News knows that the longer it drags out the lawsuit, the more it loses as well. So no, Fox News isn't just going to flaunt its financial clout around. Back to my argument. Two more reasons why they shut down discourse. First, because the state has asymmetrical financial wealth as compared to a civil lawsuit where the financial disparity is mitigated because it's an individual instance using his own personal wealth. The state has undisputed financial clout, so you make oppression easier. Secondly, the state has its own organs. As an individual, I don't have a police force. I don't have a jail to throw dissidents into. The state has all these apparatus at its disposal, which means that the chilling effect is far easier. Then, so when they brought up the instance where your son committed suicide, but it's incredibly patronizing to suggest that that only happened because of a lie, completely ignoring the multi-causal factors that led to someone taking his own life. So that's discourse dealt with. Now moving on to my substantive about how this hurts victims. This will further clash with their analysis about the little man on the ground who was hurt. We start from the foundation that in a criminal prosecution, the state decides if you have been harmed. Hold on a minute, and if the damage to your reputation is severe. That's when the state decides if your case is worth a prosecution. Before I move on, yes.
Aren't independent judiciaries much more likely in dictatorships than them being able to use their financial clout in a civil suit to shut down discourse?
No. Okay, if your independent judiciary is independent, then it's going to be independent regardless of whether it's a criminal or civil lawsuit. There's no meaningful distinction. Back to my argument. On the first level, we think it's wrong in principle for a state to pass a judgment on whether you have been hurt. We reject the idea that the state has a right to decide if someone accusing me of being sexist or racist has harmed me. Because it's an intrinsically personal evaluation of the damage that has caused to me. So the state can't pass a judgment by deciding whether or not I truly have been hurt and then whether or not to take up that as a criminal lawsuit. So victims must have the choice to turn to a civil lawsuit with a judge hearing. For instance, in Monaco, where defamation is a prosecutor offense, the choice of the prosecutor's office to drop allegations of defamation from the entrepreneur Henry Dowses meant that rumors that his invention, an energy-saving fridge, was unsafe continued to persist, and this eventually bankrupted him. The reason for his case being dropped? Because he was only a owner of a small SME. So therefore, he was unimportant to the state. So So on your own metric about the little man on the ground who is hurt, their side hurts it more because the state is unlikely to stand up for and protect these people. Second then, why are criminal courts more likely to throw these cases out? Because currently state courts are overworked, so they tend to focus on the more seemingly important cases. Namely, the cases we brought to you in our first figure about political leaders. So yes, states are more likely to devote all their resources into pressing defamation charges against greater political threats, rather than ignoring the little man on the ground. This is especially because, unlike a civil lawsuit is based on a negotiated settlement, a compromise as we told you. The difference with a criminal prosecution is that you pass a definite judgment. Therefore, the stakes are much higher when it comes to the state passing a prosecution. So they're likely to be far more judicious when it comes to which cases they're willing to take up. No, in Estonia, where defamation is a criminal offense, almost 13,000 defamation reports are not brought to the court by the prosecutor's office. So they hurt the average man on the ground who is seeking redress for the harm he has suffered. But finally, opposition might tell you that if cases are thrown out by the courts, they can simply then turn to civil lawsuits afterwards. This doesn't happen because after a criminal court has thrown out your case and rejected it as an instance where defamation has not occurred, it makes it systemically harder for you to then turn to a civil lawsuit. There's a perception, the court has already passed a judgment, that this is not an instance of defamation. Your lawyers are unlikely to take up your case. Your judges are unlikely to stand on your side, which means that even if on our side we have the alternative of civil lawsuits, this is an alternative that's systemically devalued and demeaned when you have the state prosecuting you for defamation. Therefore, for all these reasons, they hurt victims, the very victims they want to seek redress for and protect. By their own metric, their side fails. That's why we're proud to stand by the principle that we support the rule of law, not the rule by law.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, about halfway through our prep session today, we stopped and we said, wait, what if Singapore run this as civil versus criminal? And we stopped and we said, no, there's no way they would do that. That's mad. It's clearly not the motion. It would undermine their principle, and there's absolutely no difference. Today, ladies and gentlemen, they did do that. And today, Team Singapore had to stand up and prove to you why defamation should not be prosecuted ever, whether it be civil or criminal. They ran from that burden, and they ran from the real world. Their entire case is based upon a false conceptualization of how defamation works. Because most criminal suits don't end in a jail sentence, unless, say, you live in North Korea, in which case there are other problems. Rather, they end in a fine, in which case they are exactly the same as the kind of civil suits that they think work well. Ultimately, no thank you, Team Singapore brought you a debate about semantics, whether it should be a criminal fine or a civil fine. And on that basis alone, they must lose this debate. But unfortunately, no
Point
thank
of
you.
information.
We still have to argue while pretending there's an actual difference between civil and criminal defamation. Maybe you end up lengthily imprisoned like they want to pretend. That happens in perhaps 2 countries in the world. I'm sorry, but we've got to do it. So we've told you 2 things so far. Firstly, we gave you our principled case.
Information.
Secondly, no thank you, we talked about the harms of reputational damage. Thirdly, we're going to discuss how this policy distorts debate. That's why we bring you the T line. The decriminalizing defamation distorts debate and destroys decent people. They tell you that their principle stands because perjury is different from defamation. And the reason they give for that,
Defamation.
just a minute, is that defamation is multi-causal, and that perjury leads you straight to jail, whereas defamation doesn't necessarily lead straight to depression or ruining people's lives. It depends on your friends, or it depends on if you're believed. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are not believed in court, the person does not end up in jail. So that also applies to perjury. Secondly, this is a pretty ridiculous distinction, because there are many cases in which defamation obviously does directly lead to harm. We give you, for example, the example of Max Mosley, who was publicly defamed and then saw his son commit suicide because of that.
What's
So
the
the principle
information?
is undermined. Go ahead.
So, do you think his son committed suicide only because people told lies about his dad? Also because, very unfortunately, there are probably complex other causes, including psychological issues
No, thank you.
with that child.
Yes, he explicitly did that. He left a suicide note saying that is exactly what he did. So, then they tell you that illiberal countries are using defamation to jail their critics. Our response to that is that illiberal countries are bad for many reasons. If you really want to talk about Argentina or Venezuela or Iran, they will slam their critics in jail on whatever trumped up charges they want. This is the real world. We'd like to debate it. No, thank you. Singapore seemed to think that Xi Jinping and Erdogan will just wake up tomorrow morning after their motion passes and go, aha, you got me guys, no more dictatorship now. We can't prosecute people under criminal defamation. They will find other ways to do this. In fact, largely dissidents are not prosecuted under this law because they simply don't have to.
Defamation.
Sure.
Defamation is far worse for illiberal regimes because now there's a perception that the charge is legitimate. Deal with that, don't stir the issue.
Everything is far worse in the liberal regimes. You can't keep standing up and trying to pretend that people will stop throwing their critics in jail in Iran if you change the way that defamation law works. Then, they bring us this point of information about a Christian that talks about the sun and how the sun revolves around the world. This again betrays the fact that they don't really understand defamation. That's not defamatory because it doesn't hurt anyone's reputation. Unless you think the sun and the moon are people, which in fact they are not. No thank you. So, about how this motion distorts politics. Well, it allows the media to attack politicians in order to sell papers. Firstly. That's because scurrilous rumors and sensational scandals are just way more fun to read about than boring stuff about policy, and they sell more newspapers. That is a fact. This allows media
Defamation.
to pick politicians and go after them by doing anything as serious from alleging pedophilia to making this whole kerfuffle over Obama's birth certificate. Even this, the birth certificate stuff, distracted from the real issues in the 2012 political election. It took up airtime. It meant that political discussion was about salacious gossip and not policy. This is bad, because democracy relies upon an informed and educated
Information.
public. And the media here were not informing or educating anyone. Defamation law here is critical because with it, you can launch a public legal attack and win clearly with the full force of judicial legitimacy. Even if everyone doesn't hear about it, the person that you're suing still gets financial damage, which means they're still disincentivized from doing it again. But without it, you have to protest continuously,
Information.
no thank you, in your own advertisements. That costs time, that costs money, and it leaves you open to the charge that, aha, the lady doth protest too much, perhaps these charges are accurate. It may be true, meanwhile, that your own newspapers as a politician might support you when you speak up, but then it just becomes two sides throwing mud at each other, and you don't have the clarity of a court to decide who is correct and who is not. Secondly, this policy devalues legitimate criticism. That's because without any defamation laws, any valid criticism that's raised by, say, investigative journalists or activists, no thank you, becomes mixed with other criticism from crazy people. That means that when you get someone saying, this company burns waste, or this company pollutes rivers, they're mixed in with other people that say, this company kills babies, or this company is sick, or people that say seemingly legitimate sounding rumors that happen to also be false.
Bunch of
No,
information.
thank you, worse than the status quo. Because not only do now the crazies have no disincentive to come forward, but they also can't be sued, and I guess if you have to go with this definition, can't be put in jail, so therefore are comparatively less likely to do this. So corporations get unfairly slandered. But also, legitimate critics are less likely to come forward Because they know,
Point of information.
that their truth will be lost in the oceans of garbage that are now being spread about these people or these corporations. Which means that it's very easy for them to be dismissed by the company or the public figure in question by just saying, look, you are just one more out of a sea of raving lunatics. We didn't pollute these forests. I did not sleep with that woman as a politician. And for you to be discredited, that means that people that have real information about powerful people, be they politicians, be they corporations, or be they celebrities, won't be able to either come forward and get their rumors, legitimate rumors in this case, heard, but they'll also be drowned out by the sea of nonsense. Again, if we have to go with this defamation, it becomes a comparative. If you really believe that people get thrown in jail, then I guess that's more of a disincentive. So again, all these arguments still work on the comparative. We do, though, with this in the real debate that was set. Ladies and gentlemen, decriminalizing defamation distorts debate. It destroys decent people. We oppose.
Proposition. I call open the sheet.
Let's make it absolutely clear. Often, debate is about the meaning of words. Because it is the meaning of words that tells us what the motion means. So Team England's burden was to prove that we should not prosecute you for acts of defamation. Their burden was to clash with the case we presented, not with the case they wanted us to run. So don't let their second speaker's humor evade the clash that we fairly set up in our first speaker. I'm going to analyze this debate in three key areas. One, on criminal versus civil suits and the principles behind our case. Two, on ways that best help social discourse. And third, on victims, a point that opposition conveniently ignored. First, on criminal versus civil suits. Now, we started from the intuitive premise that defamation doesn't meet the threshold of criminality. I'll remind you of the three reasons why. No, thank you. One, because it doesn't break a tenet needed for society to function. Two, there is no way to prove that harms accrue beyond reasonable doubt. And three, that the actual harms of defamation are inherently variable and vague. What did we hear? One, we can determine the impact of lies. The only parallel given was to substitute analysis, perjury. This is a fallacious parallel, because at the point in which you lie in court, you demonstrate contempt of the judiciary, which is one of the core tenets of justice and the core tenet in which our society functions on. So their parallel actually dovetails with our principle. But even if we argue that it's exactly the same, we think that it's okay to lie in court, even if you concede all the arguments my second speaker told you, because lies are caught out by prosecutors and lawyers all the time. There isn't direct causality or consistent harms demonstrated in that case. So even if you want to draw this parallel, we are okay with it. No thank you. The next thing we heard, what about Fox News? Can they drag out civil suits for a really, really long time, causing massive amounts of harm? The problem with this is that it ignores our analysis on consistent versus variable harms. Because in a case-by-case suit, when I sue you for defamation, the court can judge based on the individual harms and based on individual context of that particular action. Compare this, no thank you, to criminal proceedings, where the state has to levy equal fines based on legislation. So in their world, Fox News might have to pay, say, $10,000 to everybody that sues it for defamation. Or in our world, the court may be able to compel it to pay lots and lots of money based on particular circumstances. The next thing we heard, but this causes massive harm, and courts are in place to prosecute you based on massive harm. And the only example we heard was that of suicide. I'd like to point out that their own rebuttal works against them when they talk about autocracies. Because the fact that not everybody who has been defamed commits suicide seems to indicate that the causality of suicide was multi-causal in nature. That at the point in which a court defines whether or not defamation causes you to commit suicide, no thank you, the harms are inherently multi-causal, are inherently nebulous, so they can't use this example to prove harms on our side. And I'd like to point out, even if we concede, no thank you, that the justice system exists for harm, we never deny that defamation causes harm. That's why these civil courts exist in order to redress for this harm. That if I as an individual feel unfairly maligned by lies, then I can similarly seek redress. The difference is that no one is prosecuting you, that I as an individual are bringing my case to court. No thank you. Alright, so the next larger area on discourse. We argue that criminalizing defamation means shutting down discourse in 3 ways. 1, because the government is making certain speech criminal and give me a moment. 2, that they shut down discourse in certain legal regimes. And 3, there's no natural check on an overly litigious state. But before I go on, yes ma'am.
If the rule of law is so terrible in the countries you're talking about, why are you putting so much faith in their civil courts?
Thanks for that POI. I was right about to deal with it. Because we aren't arguing about regimes like North Korea or Iran. We think that yes, they will jail you anyway. What we are talking about are semi-liberal democracies like Malaysia or Pakistan, where you can't simply chuck people in jail because the international community will condemn you. You'll be voted out even in such semi-liberal democracies. Don't let them misrepresent our case. And the problem with defamation is that it's used to silence dissent because it gives governments the veneer of legitimacy, because it's vague and seemingly the justice system might justify the kind of shutting out of discourse. So it's not about the misapplication of defamation laws, but rather about how defamation is systemically used for abuse. We give you the example of Malaysia, where UMNO uses defamation laws to shut out discourse regarding government's civil service patronage in many cases. We argue that even if they want us to talk about the most illegal regimes like North Korea and Iran, at least we give them one less means to entrench their autocracy. So even in their worst case scenario, at least we aren't complicit in the kinds of harms that accrue. I'd like to point out here that opposition has ignored our argument on how it stops people from critiquing state institutions. Because when I critique, say, the public service, if I critique, say, the courts, no individual can bring that to sue me. However, in their paradigm, the state can shut out my discourse on particular institutions, making it so much harder for genuine democratic discourse to occur. Next we heard, lies are always bad because they muddy the waters of discourse. But before I go on, I'll take them first.
Pakistan has extensive sedition laws that it generally uses rather than defamation laws to imprison opponents. Why has that changed?
So we argue that in Pakistan, sedition laws apply generally to things like hate speech, things like hating on a particular religion. And even if it doesn't, we argue that our side will push for these sedition laws not to be in place. That's the premise of us saying that states should not be prosecuting you for defamation. So that's exactly our point. But the next thing we heard, they muddy the waters of discourse. Now, opposition doesn't understand the nature of discourse. Because the more public your lies, the easier it becomes to call you out on it. That's why politicians are subject to independent fact-checking institutions. Fox News is pilloried on social media for being 40% lies and 60% fact. So, the next thing we heard, political discourse will turn into mudslinging. First response, there is no incentive for a politician to do this. Because at the point in which all politicians are engaging in mudslinging, the first mover of a politician who tells the truth, who bases his arguments on policy, would win. So often this mudslinging is a minority case scenario. 2, who are we to place normative judgment on talking about the character of a politician? Often this is important for a voter to know. Because if a politician can silence you on the premise that what you are saying is defaming him, there is no clear metric upon which we can judge that harm. And it's precisely because they chill discourse that they prevent talk about things like characteristics of politicians, which is important for democracy. And we tested their principle. If they were against such muddying of waters, why don't they make all lies illegal? Because all lies to some extent can't be called out. We had no response. So even on their side, they still succumb to the oceans of garbage that the second speaker talked about. No clear response. Clearly, the truth is dependent on whether the public can effectively evaluate the truth. So that's not really an argument that stands anymore on opposition. Lastly, on victims. And we have told you down the line that their side hurts victims because states are more likely to throw cases of defamation out of court. We have told you how people are systemically disabled from turning to civil lawsuits after a criminal court has rejected it. Because at the point of you turning something criminal, you can't launch a civil suit on it. For instance, if somebody steals from me, I cannot sue him in a civil suit. The state effectively takes over. And at the point at which defamation is inherently a variable harm, it should be on the individual to be able to pursue those harms in a circumstantial manner. They hurt victims, they hurt justice, they hurt democracy. I am incredibly proud to propose.
Proposition speaker for his speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, I call open Bill.
Well, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, Team Singapore today wanted to have a debate. It seemed more fitting for the dense pages of the Harvard Law Review than for a world school's Octo-Final, about the semantics and about the minutiae of law between whether we should prosecute on civil or on criminal grounds. Here's the thing. Given that in the vast majority of cases around the world, if you prosecute someone criminally for defamation, the punishment is a fine, the same punishment as in a civil case. To base their case on that very narrow distinction was utterly ridiculous in today's debate. But a further consequence of this narrowing was they further wanted to blink themselves, not to actually many countries around the world where these laws are implemented actually pretty well, by saying, well, not every country is France, the UK, or the USA. That might be true, but lots of countries implement their defamation laws in similar ways to France, the UK, and the USA. They wanted to talk about countries locking up their opponents, not as they wanted to say North Korea and Iran, because clearly, no thanks, that would be ridiculous, but rather Pakistan and Malaysia, the two examples they gave of the countries who routinely misuse these kind of laws. Ignoring that in both cases, these are countries that routinely use sedition laws, blasphemy laws in the case of Pakistan, to imprison their opponents. And ignoring crucially,
Point of information.
no thank you, the governments will not simply stop imprisoning their opponents if we remove defamation laws from their grasp, nor will they stop doing so legitimately, because often governments can claim very legitimate things on national security grounds to do exactly the same thing. So they had a very narrow definition of today's debate, and an even narrower impact of today's debate. And on the contrast, Team England wanted to have a real debate about defamation laws in the vast majority of cases, and whether they were a good thing or not a good thing. And that's why we come to you today on the team line, that decriminalising defamation distorts debate and it destroys decent people's lives. I'll look at three areas in this first speech. Firstly, the principle. Secondly, going after the powerful.
Information, sir.
And thirdly, protecting the individual. So first, let's look at the principle. So the first thing that we have to ask is what this debate is really about, and whether the bizarre distinction that Singapore wants to fight on between civil and criminal is really legitimate. Now, firstly, as we mentioned, it is bizarre given that in the vast majority of cases, it's not people sitting in jail for defamation. We'd like to show you the examples of these people.
Point of information.
In fact, we think there are a trivial number of them. Rather, when the state prosecutes people for defamation, it is making them pay a fine in much the same way as civil courts will order you to pay a fine if you lose. The distinction there is so small that it is actually hard to see. We were also willing to fight it on their grounds, no thanks, and say that given that both sides seem to support defamation being implemented in some senses, that actually the state needs to be there to implement it for the people who can't bring the big civil cases. They just said, well, why can Fox just drag out these legal cases for years and years? I would suggest it's because Fox has far more lawyers than the people who they criticise and make things up about on a regular basis.
Points of information.
No thanks, and that's why they just simply didn't have an understanding of the real world. But it was also bizarre, given that their characterisation was that the state controls courts and writes laws in the first place. And given that, it was unclear why the civil courts would be so much better and so much more independent. Presumably, the state on their side will just use civil laws to protect all of their cronies in court and to stop this from happening. Go ahead.
If you think that civil courts are always just useless and a bizarre distinction, will you abolish all civil courts? Since anything that could be done in a civil court might as well just be done in a criminal court with a fine anyway.
Very clearly, we support both on our side. What we're saying is that often the state needs to step in because there are people who won't be able to represent themselves in a civil court. And the bizarre assumption that simply civil courts can just plug that gap all the time simply isn't true. But the big principal justification they wanted to bring us about why we shouldn't prosecute defamation is that there's no direct harm. Except, clearly there is, when these things that people are saying about you forces you to quit your job. It means that people from your family never talk to you ever again. What they said was, well, that's difficult to prove. Well, yes, it's difficult to prove. That's why we have, law courts to prove these kind of things, which do so in all kinds of criminal cases. Finally, though, we said that defamation is principally unjust because it distorts discourse. And they said, well, would you ban people from saying that the sun revolves around the earth? Firstly, that is clearly not a defamatory statement to anyone. But secondly, that presumably would hugely distort discourse if it was a very widely held belief, which is why, when it was a very widely held belief, that did distort discourse massively.
What the defamation?
Secondly, this is it going after the powerful. Because a consequence of their narrow stance was that they only wanted to talk about dictators locking up prisons. And as I've already said, dictators will not only still do this, or illiberal democracies will not only still do this, they will still do it with a veneer of legitimacy as well. And that was a ridiculously narrow ground for them to fight this invasion. But even the worst cases of the kind of dictatorships they wanted to talk about, their case rests on a crucial mischaracterization of dictatorships, which is to conflate the government and the judiciary. Because even in the case of Zimbabwe, probably one of the worst regimes in the world, they actually have a relatively strong and functioning judiciary that can prevent the government from misusing defamation laws in the way that you think all governments necessarily will. But finally, we talked about criticism, genuine criticism of public figures.
What's of information?
I'll take just 1 second. Being devalued when it's alongside lies. They say no, because it's very easy to see when a criticism is obviously false and when a criticism is obviously true. Except it's not when you don't have defamation laws, which can clearly say, no, this thing is false. Go ahead.
So, are you going to prosecute all defamatory statements, or only those defamatory statements which are widely held public beliefs?
Well, we're going to prosecute defamatory statements that do the most harm. That's a consequence of states having limited resources and having to prioritize. Obviously, we'd like to prosecute all defamatory statements because we think that they do a lot of harm. We would go after the ones that do the most. Thirdly, let's look at protecting individuals. Defamation does do real harm. The only contention that Singapore brought was that this harm is sometimes hard to prove. How could we prove that Max Mosley's son committed suicide because of the horrible stories about his family in the press? No thanks. There could have been other psychological impacts. Yes, there could have been other psychological impacts. This could have just been one of these huge impacts on his mental state, which we were able to prosecute those newspapers. But the second thing we need to say is that it is important to have the state involved. Because it's very difficult often for the people who big media outlets criticise to actually bring those lawsuits against them. And they admitted that. They said, no thanks, but actually these people will just settle it out of court. But what does settling it out of court mean? It means that sometimes people get paid off a trivial amount, and newspapers factor that into their calculation, and then they continue to lie and to lie and to lie and to ruin people's lives. They say states aren't going to stand up for little people because state courts are overcrowded. We would say that on the comparative, they are probably more likely to do so than civil courts, where you often need a huge amount of money to bring that prosecution. But finally, even if they did want to talk about governments going after individuals, the crucial thing they ignore is the governments can defame their opponents, and that is crucial. And we think that actually often, if people are criticising the government on their side, when all barriers to criminal defamation prosecutions are removed, what governments are most likely to do is to spread rumours about people who criticise them that destroy their careers and make sure that criticism is never seen as valid. Ladies and gentlemen, ultimately, this was a debate about whether we should have defamation laws. And we think that this was a debate that Singapore lost because they were unwilling to fight it on the real grounds. And that's why we come to you today on the team line, that decriminalising defamation distorts debate and destroys people's lives. And that is why
opposition team will deliver their reply speech first. There are no points of information during reply speeches. To deliver the opposition reply speech, I call open A-Link.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's quite hard to do your reply when faced with a narrow opposition, with a narrower impact of their policy. And it's even harder when even that ground they try to contest couldn't go their way. I mean, we told you on Team England that free speech should not be protected here, a clear principled stance. We told you about the harms of reputational damage, why those are so great. And we told you why defamation distorts debate. Singapore gave you a lot of material about the minute difference between criminal and civil law, but ultimately they couldn't win today's debate on the principle or the practical. I'm going to be asking two questions in this report. Should we punish defamation at all? And how should we punish defamation? Team England were proud to continue their team line throughout their case that decriminalising defamation distorts debate, destroys decency. On this first question of punishing defamation, there was simply no clash here at all, because we told you why protecting lies undermines the very reasons that we value free speech, about self-expression, about discovery. And we told you that defamation hurts people in very real, very damaging ways. And this was entirely conceded by the proposition case, because they wanted to punish defamation as well. Ultimately, they didn't really have a principled stance on defamation, so clearly England will decide with a principle. But on the second question, then, of how we should punish defamation, ultimately it was consistent throughout our side that we want defamation to be punished in any way possible. In the vast majority of cases around the world, that is through civil court. That is where the bulk of this debate must lie. But even if we have to turn to criminal proceedings, we're very happy with that. Sometimes the state does have to step in and does have to defend people from big corporations that just won't go willingly to civil cases. And ultimately we told you why. There is sufficient harm to the people involved in defamation cases to invoke the protection of the state when they have nowhere else to turn. And we also told you why weaker punishments for defamation in general damage discourse so greatly. This was largely dropped by Singapore, who couldn't face up to the fact that when you were allowed to muddy the water, when you were allowed to have competing statements that might be true, might be false, truth is a lot harder to discover. People aren't that. But ultimately, their primary contention in today's debate was about the impact that this motion has in illiberal regimes. But we told you on our side that in the real life of illiberal regimes, they'll probably lock up dissenters anyway under the vast number of other laws they have to do this with the veneer of legitimacy Singapore care about. But we also told you we don't think the harms are that great in defamation because of the independent judiciaries that often exist in even the worst dictatorships that they wanted to talk about. But look, even in Singapore's bizarre world where they characterise these dictators as caring so much about legitimacy, having such a monopoly on power throughout the country, it's very unclear why the civil courts will be any better if these regimes have such a strong incentive to use those courts that are now their only recourse for that veneer of legitimacy to bring people to actual justice. So ultimately, in terms of how we prosecute defamation as well, England's position that in the majority of civil cases we're happy to do it, in the minority of criminal cases we're still happy to do it as well. We win that one. Decriminalising defamation distorts debate and destroys decent people. We were very proud to
And now, to conclude the
You know guys, for an Octo-Final in the World Schools Debating Championship, of course the motion isn't just about a general motion about defamation, because all of you know the standard arguments, right? That's why you have a specific and narrow motion calling for us to challenge the differences between a criminal lawsuit and a civil lawsuit. And this is a narrow distinction that opposition was afraid of and unwilling to engage on. So let's take a look at the two votes we saw in today's debate and show you what was Proposition 12 that truly stood for the essence of truth as well as discourse. But first, what was the vote of opposition? It was when their defense of truth and debate rang hollow. When they said there was no clash in this debate, it was only because they refused to clash. What exactly was their vision of truth on their side? It was a truth that had to be engineered by the government because it's a truth that people were too weak to recognize. That's when their vote shrank. Because it started from prosecuting all lies to prosecuting lies that everyone believes to prosecuting lies that everyone believes and does massive harm. So they never stood true to their principle of truth and honesty. But really, what was truth in their vote? It was truth when the government could threaten to imprison or, in their own words, even fine you to the point of bankruptcy. It was the truth where you couldn't criticize the civil service, you couldn't criticize the judiciary because that meant potentially losing your freedom of movement. It was the truth that came about where you had to pay the price because the state had that much more money than you did to defend yourself in a civil suit. It was the truth that the state had to manipulate its own organs, such as the police force as well as jails, to engineer that truth. That's why when they talked about hurting and destroying decent people on the ground, they refused to respond to our analysis that you hurt the very people on the ground who most need that protection by means of turning to a civil lawsuit, when their choice isn't a suit by a state. This was a point we brought up in our second speaker, completely dropped down the line throughout opposition's case. That's when they finally crossed the House in their reply speaker. Listen to their language. In the vast majority of instances, it's civil courts that are better if they don't want to debate the narrow grounds of criminal courts. But the motion clearly calls for proposition to defend civil courts and for them to defend criminal ones. So at the very end of today's debate, their vote was an inconsistent one that did not protect truth and in fact conceded that civil courts were much better. Well, that was the alternative we offered you on side proposition. Don't get us wrong, we had principles of our own. Our principles was that this cause could never be criminalized. That's why our vote stood firm, because our principle was that the state can inflict massive harm on you by jailing you or bankrupting you. But that's why just muddying the truth doesn't cut it. We told you 3 things. 1, direct causality. 2, how it's mediated by many factors. 3, how defamation doesn't threaten the very functioning of a state. All of which were 3 principal tiers that opposition never engaged with. We protected the integrity of truth. It's a truth that everyone believes and subscribes to because it has stood the test of time, not because it was distorted by the government and repackaged as truth. That's why a wealthy businessman on our side can still defend himself without the state as his crutch because he has the alternative of civil courts. Civil courts where the state can't use the police and DPP as state apparatus. Civil courts where he can criticize the civil service. That's how we protected the little man on the ground. But we never talked about dictatorship only. We clashed on the full spectrum. So for dictatorships like Zimbabwe, we didn't make it seem like defamation was legitimate because it was so big. But even, I'm sorry to say, in Singapore, when the government does threaten media reporting by, for instance, creating a chilling effect, that's why the Straits Times, our local newspaper, only ever presents a positive portrayal of the government. That is something that's a truth that our side did not have to stand for. That's why we protected victims because they had the autonomy to turn to civil courts without state interference. And we're proud to stand by the principle that we support the rule of law, not the rule by law.